we don't use back there. But to do that, everything that we do use gets unhooked and rehooked back, so hopefully everything is back to the way, or semi, because I found some issues with some things, so hopefully everything is, we good? Tree.
Yes,
Are we
we've been
coming
good for
through?
a while.
All right, Psalm 57. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge, until the destroying storms pass by. I cry to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame those who trample on me. God will send forth his steadfast love and his faithfulness. I lie down among lions that greedily devour human prey. Their teeth are spears and arrows, their tongues sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my path, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my soul. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. For your steadfast love is as high as the heavens. Your faithfulness extends to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. And Lord, we pray that your Spirit will be present with us this morning as we consider your words together. It is in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, so technically, we're at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2. That's where we got into a little bit last week. We started talking a little bit about the Sabbath, but I feel like we ended up talking about everything but the Sabbath. So this morning we're going to talk about the Sabbath a little bit more to prepare us to get into the second creation account, which starts in the second half of Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4. I know I've kind of defined Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, where Israel would rest from all of their work, which was rooted in the fact that God on the seventh day rested from all of his work. We talked about how this is rooted in the resting of God here at the end or the conclusion of the first creation account. But the Sabbath for Israel does not get mentioned until the book of Exodus. In Exodus, we get the Ten Commandments, and in the Ten Commandments, the fourth commandment is to honor the Sabbath. And the reason that Israel is to honor the Sabbath is you have a reference back here to Genesis chapter 1 and the resting of God on the seventh day. With that being said, I want us to discuss a little bit about the Sabbath. I'll turn it over to you guys to get us started. Why did you think that Israel observes the Sabbath? Why is the Sabbath so important to them? I'm going to give the easy answer. God told them to. So God told them to do it, so they did it. Yes. But what are some other reasons that you think that Israel observes the Sabbath?
That was the day God rested.
So what does that mean? If God rested on the seventh day, and Israel thinks, well, because God rested, we should rest. What's the next layer there? What's Israel trying to do?
To be like God.
Yes, they're trying to be like God. So for Israel, to observe the Sabbath is for them to live by reflecting God. So maybe my favorite chapter of the Old Testament is Leviticus chapter 19. In Leviticus 19, not only do we get the command to love your neighbor as yourself, that Jesus quotes in the Gospels as the second greatest commandment, but the beginning of Leviticus 19 begins with God telling Israel that they are to be holy as I am holy. And the way that Leviticus 19 is structured is all of the commands in Leviticus 19 come back to the idea of Israel being holy as God is holy. So it's in essence, God says you are to be holy, which holiness is just to be set apart, to be different. So in the way that God is different, not only from other gods or other spiritual beings, but God is also different than everything else that exists. Israel is to be different. Israel is to be different specifically from the other nations around them. They are to look different. They are to live different because they're God's people. So since Israel is the chosen people of a God who is holy, a God who is different, Israel is to mimic or reflect that by also being holy or different. And the rest of Leviticus 19 is then, this is what it looks like to do that. If you want to be holy, if you want to be different, here are the things that you do. And included in that is to love your neighbor as yourself. Specifically, that command is in the context of your fellow Israelites, that the community that Israel was meant to create is a community of people that looks different than the communities of other nations. They love the people of that community as their neighbor. They love the people of that community as they love themselves. The end of Leviticus 19, though, expands that beyond just Israel, because they're told when a stranger, an alien, a sojourner, depending on your translation, so a non-Israelite comes into the land of Israel, you treat the outsider as if they are an insider. So you've created this community where everyone is loving each other. And when outsiders step into this community, they're invited to be fully a part of the community. You treat them as a part of this community when they are in your land, the land that makes up your community. And that's what it means for Israel to be holy as God is holy. I say that to say that it's the same principle as what we see with the Sabbath. If Israel's following God, if Israel is God's chosen people, then the implication there is they need to look like God, they need to live like God, they need to do things in the way that God does things, and that is holiness, according to Leviticus 19. It's also the Sabbath, and I would also argue that that's probably rooted in the idea of human beings in general being created as image bearers of God. So the theology seems to go something like this. Human beings are created to reflect God back into the creation. So you think of God as this bright light. This language we see throughout the Old and New Testament, right? God is light as opposed to darkness. God is light. The world at the beginning, Genesis 1, 1 and 2, is darkness, and God creates something out of that. After the fall, the world is darkness. So in the midst of the darkness, what human beings are to do is to be God's mirror, to reflect that light into the rest of the world. When the fall happens in Genesis 3, the world becomes dark because sin enters into the world. And so the job of God's people, the job of Israel, is to be a light to the rest of the world. That means they reflect the light of God into the darkness that exists in the rest of the world. If that's Israel's job, and if Israel is doing that job, which more often than not they don't, right? But if, theoretically, Israel is fulfilling that role, then by necessity, they have to look like God. I hope that makes sense. If they're reflecting God, then they have to look like God. They have to do things in the way of God. So that's not just because they're God's chosen people, but it's because as God's chosen people, they're the ones through whom God is trying to restore human beings' ability to reflect God's image, because Israel's ultimate job is to be a light to the rest of the nations, to show the other nations this is what it looks like. When you read, particularly in the Psalms or in the prophets, about Mount Zion, so Mount Zion is connected with the Temple Mount. So the temple, God's dwelling place, is on the top of the Temple Mount. And the reason for that is because if the gods are up there, or if Yahweh's up there, depending on what God you're worshiping, but all people thought this, if spiritual beings are up there, how do you come in contact with them? Well, you have to go up there. And how do you do that? Well, you go up a mountain. That's why temples were placed on top of mountains. So the language of Mount Zion is the Temple Mount. So this is where you go up to contact God. And the hope in the Psalms and in the prophets is that one day something's going to happen and all of the nations are going to be drawn to Mount Zion. So it's not just God's going to do something for Israel, but God's going to use Israel and draw in all the nations. And so what God is trying to do through Israel, by drawing in all the nations, is make all human beings reflectors of God's light, because that's how God created us to be. Israel fails more often than they succeed at doing that. One of the main reasons that they fail is that they forget that they're for the rest of the world. So they turn their gaze inwardly. It's us versus them. And God would say, no, it's you for them. It's not you against them, it's you for them and for the rest of the world. I think that's why we get stories such as the story of Ruth, who's an outsider who shows to be more faithful than most of the insiders. Stories of Rahab, another outsider that gets brought inside. I think that's why God uses these women who were outsiders, and not just ethnically, but also as women, or Rahab as a prostitute, so as outside as an outsider can get, and yet God uses them to bring about Jesus, who is the one that is capable of restoring human beings' ability to be those image bearers of God. It's why Matthew mentions people like Ruth and Rahab in his genealogy as he begins his gospel, which is something very, very unique that Matthew does. That's a long way of saying, to me, that's the most important thing about the Sabbath. It's not that Israel rests. It's not that God tells them they need to rest, but it's that their rest reflects God. It also reflects God's intention for creation. So God builds rest into his creation because God rests as a part of it. So for Israel to rest is not merely to reflect God, it's to live in the way that God designed creation to live. Do y'all know how many different Sabbaths Israel was supposed to observe? Yes.
Every.
Well, so there are different kinds of Sabbaths. So you have the Saturday Sabbath, which is every single week. There's 2 more Sabbaths. Does anybody know? Second Sabbath is every 7 days they rest. Every 7 years. The land has a Sabbath. If you read the prophets, one of the reasons Israel's taken into captivity is they failed to give the land its Sabbath. We think Israel goes into captivity because they worship idols. That's like reason number 5, if you actually read the prophets. Reason number 1 is the way they treated the poor and the widow and the orphan. The way they treated the least of these. One of the second most common ones is that they didn't give the land its Sabbath. They abused God's creation. And so God sends them into captivity. So human beings are to rest. The land is to rest. you even think the way this is reflected in the lifestyle of animals, right? So if you think of sleep, animals typically don't have to catch up on their sleep, right? We miss sleep and we have to catch up. I mean, you've never seen a bird, like, I gotta fly back to my nest and catch up on some sleep because I didn't get enough last night. That's not really the way the animal kingdom, the animal kingdom has its cycles. Nocturnal animals sleep during the day, you're out during the night. Animals like bears hibernate, right? So they go these long periods of not semi-rest, because they're not just, sleeping during hibernation, but their activity is toned back for a large period of time. And rest is not always sleep, first off. And that's seen in like bears that hibernate, so they tone back their activity. They exert less calories, and so they're not eating as much, they're not moving as much. So
You said they rest every 7 days. Why? Why is that?
because God rested on the seventh day.
Okay.
And so the number 7 is metaphorical for completeness. So why do we get 7 days of creation? Because in 7 days God completes his work. So 7 is a form of completeness. So Israel rests every 7 days. So it completes their work week. The creation rests every 7 years. So you till the land for 6 years, and then on the 7th year you let it rest, which again is metaphorical for the completeness of Israel's work. And then every 7 sets of 7 years, which is 49, on the 50th year, Israel has their final Sabbath that they're supposed to observe. Does anybody remember what?
They call it the Jubilee?
Yes, the year of Jubilee, which Jesus references in Luke chapter 4 when he defines his ministry as release to the captives, recovery, excitement. That's Jubilee type of language. So what happens on the year of Jubilee is not only do you have all of your normal Sabbaths that are going on, but everything's set free. So you have your weekly Sabbaths where humans are set free from their work. Because remember, God created human beings to work. He tells them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and rule over it. Human beings were created to work, which is why, if you just measured the health of people, the more active that you are, and I'm not talking about going to the gym and running 5 miles, the more that you're doing things, working in the garden, whatever it is, the healthier people are. And I think that's rooted in the fact that God created us to be working beings. Now, what we're able to do changes. And sometimes that gets to a point where it's sedentary work, but if you're reading, doing something that's stimulating, that's good for your health. So God created human beings to work, but not to constantly work. So there's the distinction, right? We are to work, but we work 6 days and we rest. We're not to constantly be at work. That's unhealthy. So there's this balance. But, you hear about work-life balance. That's a part of creation. I think we've misdefined work-life balance because work-life balance as a part of creation is God-defined, not business-defined. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But you are to rest. God gave human beings the creation. So God talks about here in Genesis 1 that all the plants he's given them for food. So the creation is ours for our benefit, but not for our exploitation. So God says you can use the land for 6 years, but on the 7th, the land gets its Sabbath. Because the reminder is that all of this that God has given us is for us to steward. We don't own the creation, God does. And he has given it to us but not for our exploitation. And so we use the land for 6 years, and we let it rest the 7th year. When the year of Jubilee comes, so 7 sevens, 49, so the 50th year, you've got all that other stuff going on. But then the big thing about Jubilee is human beings are to receive their ultimate Sabbath. So everybody's set free. Slaves are set free. Anyone who's in debt, the debt's forgiven. All of that. Now, the interesting thing about Jubilee is that that was reserved for Israelites. So,
Didn't the land go back to people too?
yes. So if I had to sell you my land because of a debt, the land goes back to its original owner. And that's just for Israel. And so that goes back to, remember when Israel goes into the promised land and all the land gets divided up? The point was, that's the way it was supposed to be. But over time, things happen, right? You have to sell land because I don't know, lightning comes and burns up all your cows. I don't know what they dealt with, but they're in debt, and they have to sell the land to somebody else in order to pay the debt. But every 50 years, it's a reset. So it's resetting back to when they initially entered into the promised land. But that's just for Israel. So you weren't, if you read the laws, and an Israelite's in debt, it was the responsibility of other Israelites to purchase the land so it doesn't get sold to someone outside of Israel. Because if it's sold to someone outside of Israel, they don't get it back, because non-Israelites don't celebrate Jubilee. But that even extends to only Israelite slaves were set free. So if you read the laws, there's different ways that you interact with the slave depending on if they're an Israelite or a non-Israelite. The Israelite slaves are the ones that get set free. And I think the idea there is that they're creating this community that looks a certain way. Now, what's interesting is you have those laws, but they stand in tension with you treat the outsider like an insider. So even within the laws that God gives, there's this tension of what do we do with these outsiders? How are they treated? But the point is that Jubilee was this reset back to the way that God intended for the land to be. Now the problem is, there's no example of Israel actually ever doing that. They were instructed to do it, and I'm not saying they never did. I'm saying there's no evidence that survives to this day that illustrates they ever actually did. And the evidence that does remain from Israel, I would be very skeptical that they did ever practice that. Because again, why do they go into captivity? It's because of how they treat the poor and the widow and the orphan. If they were treating them correctly, they would be honoring Jubilee. Which is why when Jesus comes, he says he's bringing Jubilee. But the Jubilee that Jesus brings is similar but different. So Jesus physically sets captives free, and the Gospels illustrate that with the way that Jesus casts out demons. So he sets people free from their captivity to these evil spirits. But then there's the ultimate kind of, I would say, quasi-spiritual side of it, because the ultimate hope is a new creation where creation is set free. That there is this, everything is reset, but not reset to Israel entering into Canaan. It's reset to all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and God's intention. So Sabbath is a much bigger deal than I think a lot of the times we realize. It's bigger than just rest every Saturday.
So, as far as for us today, what do you think it means to us and what we should be doing?
So I think that this idea of work rest is built into God's creation. And so I think it's something that we ought to take very seriously. Though I'm not sure that the day matters anymore. So Saturday had significance to Jews. It's never really had significance to Gentiles, and very early on it stopped having significance to Christians. The significant day to Christians became Sunday. So Sunday became an easy day to see as a Sabbath day, though you could just as easily make a personal Sabbath of a Friday or something like that. So this is what I think it looks like. So the way that we work in the Western industrialized world, where we created the 5-day work week and all of that hasn't existed for most of human history. So the way that we work is it's work, vacation, work, vacation, and that's your yearly cycle. You do a bunch of work and you take a week of vacation, you do a bunch of work, you take another week of vacation, and then you start over the following year. That's kind of the way that things are set up. I don't think that's healthy. Studies show that that's not healthy. So that's not just me saying it. We know that that's typically not healthy, that that's not the best work-life or work-rest balance. Though the problem being there's not always something that we can do about it. So there's this balance between we do live in a fallen world and you still have to put food on the table regardless of what that cycle looks like. But I think there's things that we can do to get more of the creation cycle, which is not work, vacation. It's work, rest. And so when I was in school, the recommendation for us as ministers was to find a 24-hour period every week. And it doesn't have to be one day, it can span, so it could be 8 o'clock Friday night to 8 o'clock Saturday night, right? The 24-hour period. It can span between 2 days. It doesn't have to be midnight to midnight. But a 24-hour period where we turn off work and we do whatever else we want to do. You watch TV, you play video games, you go to the golf course, you go to a restaurant, you do whatever you enjoy, whatever's fun for you. We forget, I think sometimes we think that God's not a very fun God, or that God doesn't want us to have fun, but fun is all over the Old Testament. If you read Ecclesiastes, here's the gist of the book. Life sucks, so eat, drink, and be merry. That's the point of the book. If an Israelite lived too far away from the temple to come and make a sacrifice, do you know what they were supposed to do? They take the animal that they were supposed to sacrifice, and they invite all their neighbors over. They slaughter the animal, they get a bunch of wine, and they throw a big party. And that takes place of them going to the temple to worship God. God says, you use this sacrifice that is for me, and you throw a party. And the point there being fun. Enjoy, bring joy to your life. That our relationship with God is a relationship that brings fun and joy to our lives. It's not like we think of the Old Testament as this real stringent system. If you don't do this, that, and the other thing, God's going to strike you with lightning. But then God's like, well, but if you can't make it to the temple because you don't want to walk that far, throw a party. So it's not exactly the way that we make the Old Testament out to be. And so I think there's something to be said about this idea of it's not just work, rest as in sit around. It's rest as in, for most people, it's rest as in focus on God. So prayer, study, things like that. And I say for most people because I think it's a little bit different for ministers. Not that they don't use their Sabbath for God's stuff, but It's, I think, a little more important for them to use their Sabbath for fun stuff, which is connected to God. Like, you don't separate the I'm going out to have fun and that's over here and God's over there, but God actually desires that and renews us through the fun. But one, it's time that we can focus on God. So when you get into this work lifestyle, sometimes it's hard to find a way to fit God in. Sabbath is an opportunity to fit God in. It's also a time to break from the work, from the day-to-day, to say, I can take 24 hours every week to take a break from work and have faith that God's going to provide. Right? Sometimes we think if I take a break for work, this, that, or the other thing could happen and then I have to deal with it. But Jesus says if God makes sure the birds have food, how much more is God going to take care of you? So Sabbath is for us to focus on God. It's to break from work and trust in God to provide. And it's for us to have some fun, to enjoy the life that God has given us, to enjoy the creation that God has given us, to enjoy all the activities that God has given to us, to renew our soul, to renew our relationships, to renew our families. And it's something that I think needs to be a habit that is more than just a vacation we take once a year. And the way that might look, I think optimally, is every week, though that's probably not attainable for everyone. I think the optimal thing is to say, well, this is the day that we break and focus on those things. But even saying one day a month is when we take this break is better than 1 week a year. Because now you're getting 12 days instead of 7 days. So just the math says that's better than once every other week. So I think for us what it looks like is carving out those times. And that means we push everything else to other times and we have a protected time. And coming from someone who has tried to do this for 6-7 years now, and I think I'm further away from figuring out how to do it than I was when I started. It's not very easy to do, but it's something that's necessary for us to do, and sometimes, here's something that I found that's helped: rely on other people to force you to Sabbath. And I say that because, like, I'm thankful of being here where I get 5th Sundays off. Like, that's forcing me to, every quarter, take a Sabbath. Like, I don't have a choice. I feel like if I said, no, I'm going to preach, they'd be like, no, you're not. Go somewhere. Like, that I'm forced to Sabbath, which is, I know is something that I need. I haven't been in ministry for that long, 5 or 6 years, but I don't think I've ever taken all of my vacation time. Like, if I wasn't forced to take time off, I wouldn't. That's just the way that I am. And so sometimes you need other people to say, no, you're going to stop. And that's what the word rest means. It's not rest like sleep. It's rest like stop. Just stop what you're doing. And you've got your regular way of operating life, and you regularly stop that and do this, which I think is the God and the fun part.
You
which
have a job
connected.
that at any given moment, you're not going to have that rest because you've got people that depend on you. And another person that I was sitting here thinking about before that is Wendy Barnes. If Wendy Barnes and all the other nurses and doctors quit working every 7 days, where would we be? You know, then women would be having babies without men. So, you know, it can't happen, you know, the way it used to be. But even if you think about refineries, they let a guy work 14 days and then he has to have a day off. I think it's still that way. Is it still that way?
It's supposed to be.
Supposed to be, but it's not always. So it's like times change.
Well, and we're a lot worse. We're a lot worse in the United States than a lot of other developed countries when it comes to the work and rest. And
That's like 6 weeks off.
Do what?
6 weeks of mandatory vacation in Europe or somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Europe, for example, gives people a lot of time off, and what's interesting is when you look at the studies, they tend to be more productive. And so we found that out a little bit during COVID, when you look at some of the studies of when workers were given, hey, do this by this time, and we don't care how you get it done, workers tend to be more productive that way. Because they can do something like, when you're working from home, you can work for 3 hours and then play video games for 30 minutes if you want to, and then go back and work, and you get this break for play that actually makes people more productive. We've discovered, and other countries have discovered that long before we have. But some of what this takes, I think, is also, if you haven't, y'all should read the book Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. And it talks about how to create boundaries in your life, because creating boundaries is also something that's important, and something that, like, I'm not the best at. But you take someone like a minister, because that's what I do. I'm a little more familiar with. So a minister's like on call 24/7, right? Something happens, they've got to be there. But what a minister can do in creating boundaries is say, let people know this is my Sabbath, 8 o'clock on Friday, 8 o'clock on Saturday. If it's not an emergency, contact me outside of there. Or if somebody contacts them during that time and it's not something urgent, you can respond by saying, I will get to that when I'm done with my Sabbath. Like that's perfect. Thanks for letting me know. I'll make a note. And when I'm through this time, I mean, that's what you do when you take a vacation. Like, keep me in the loop, but I'll get to things when I get. So sometimes it takes boundaries, because you try to carve this out. Something's going to come up, no matter what you do. And it's not always work. Sometimes it's family. Somebody's going to call you, and somebody's going to need something. And sometimes we have this habit of thinking, well, and sometimes we put it on God. Well, God wants us to love people, and put other people first. So I drop everything that I'm doing to go and help them. And I don't think that's what God means. We had a saying when I was in school that you can't pour out of an empty bucket. That is, you pour into yourself first so that the overflow can fall into others. If you don't take care of yourself, eventually there's going to be no self left to love anybody else. And when Jesus says talks about loving others as you love yourself, that's rooted in learning how to love yourself. If you're going to love others like you love yourself, you have to love yourself first. And so sometimes there's the need to set up boundaries, but boundaries that aren't, maybe mid-high fences that you can jump over, that you can climb over if you need to, but it takes a little bit of effort, if that makes sense. Like, they're not boundaries that are these tall walls where I will not do anything, because things come up. But they're fences where it's got to be something that I've got to put the effort to get over the boundary wall. That's a very long way to answer your question. But I think thinking in that way is the beginning to thinking about what Sabbath looks like. And the difficult thing about talking about what it looks like today is that since all of our lives look different, there's not one way Sabbath can look. But the point of Sabbath is, I think, what's important in finding ways to fit that in to our lives. I've got a little bit more to say about that I'll save for next week.
I think it's just breaking routine. Like, you work 6 days a